In this painting guide, we'll be checking out the Barc Speeders for the Republic from Star Wars Legion.
Welcome to Zorb Gaming, my name's Lachlan Linton Keane and we're going to be zooming into the Barc Speeder today with a bit of a classic scheme that's nice and close to the box art with that lovely red and grey armour on the hull. We'll also look at the different configurations for our pilots and our accessories. Of course, we've got the Barc Sidecar as well with some different configurations, and we'll also look at some dynamic basing. Our first step is to get the model assembled. Now, we've got two types of plastic in this box set. The Clone Troopers are the older plastic, just like the Phase 1s, so we need to use super glue for them, but the new plastic kits for the Barcs are the lovely hard plastics full of detail, so we're going to use plastic cement for those. I've assembled these kits as per the instructions, but I'm keeping the sidecar not glued permanently to the main bike because we can just slide that in and it locks in place with a lovely snug fit, and that allows us flexibility for configuring our options every time we play the model. I've kept the clone pilots separate so that we can get full access to both separate elements, and we're going to be starting with the speeder bike. As always, we need to put a prime down on our model, and because we're working from a grey tone for this armor or the hull of this speeder bike, I'm going to use the Tamiya grey surface primer. So just give that a nice even coat. I've assembled these on just some little spraying sticks slotted up into the hole underneath the speeder bike, and you make sure you got nice even coverage all over the model. After I've got my prime down, the next step is to break down my model into painting regions so I can develop my color palette. For the Barc Speeder, my painting regions are the armor paneling, the black detail, the red panel work, the seat, the weathering approaches, and the bases. So just like in my Clone Trooper video, we're going to be using the prime as our base coat. We've got that lovely grey tone down from the Tamiya primer, and that is the perfect place to start from. So next, we're going to bring some shade in to create some definition, to really make those armor panels and all of the different kind of mechanical details pop on this model. So to do that, we're going to go back to our tried and true Lahmian medium Nuln oil glaze. This is a 50-50 mix of the medium and the glaze, which dilutes it, allows it to flow really nicely, and creates some lovely shade all over the model. So I'm going to apply this everywhere, really focusing on getting into those recessed details, all the grooves between the panels, all of the grooves and kind of recesses amongst all the mechanical components, the weapons, the feet, the blaster, the various engines. There's a lot of detail here, and we can get this shade lovely all over the model to create a great sense of that panel work and definition. Once we've applied that glaze to the sidecar and the speeder bike, you can see that the details have just come alive. The model is really starting to pop, and so much of the hard work is done by that layer. Now it's time to start creating accents and details and really establishing the proper color profile on our main panel work. So what we're going to do is create a dry brush across all of our gray armor to really give the top coat, the highlight on this panel work surface. So we're going to bring in Longbeard Gray, which is a Citadel dry paint, and do a really nice dry brush all over the model. We're going to be using a bigger size brush for this layer, so I'm actually going to pop the lid off Longbeard Gray using my scalpel so I can get a bigger brush in there, and I'm going to load that brush up, take off most of the paint on a piece of paper towel or blotting paper, and we're going to work all over the model doing circular motions to create a nice profile of highlights all across the raised regions of the model. Now there's a lot of detail here, as we've said, all over these panels, all over these components. Basically you've got that lovely mid-tone that's been toned back by your shade, and there's that lovely black line work all through the recessed details. We want all of the hard edges on this model, all of the panels, all of the engines to have a lovely little pop of a lighter grey, and that creates a fantastically realistic profile of kind of graduated grey across the armor work that is the perfect basis for our Barc Speeder. After I've got the dry brush down on the speeder bike and the sidecar, it's time to work on our black detail, and of course, we're going to be going to Black Templar from the Citadel color contrast range. We're going to be applying this on all of the particular components that we want to have a bit more of an industrial pop. So I'm going to be using that for the footrests, the various weapons, the blasters on the front and the back of the speeder. There's also a couple of vents. There's one on the back of the main speeder bike, as well as two vents on the side of the sidecar, and there's also a couple of different feet braces and various components that I've decided to pick out black to give a little bit of contrast and to break up the big broad block of color that comes from the armor paneling. Now you don't have to pick these exact zones. You could decide to make more of your guns black or less of them, just the barrels. You could pick out different vents or different detail pieces, whatever you feel like is a nice little contrasting element with the rest of your scheme. As of course this is a contrast paint, we want to apply a nice smooth coat that isn't too light or doesn't have any excess pigment pigment that is going to overpull, because we want to create a lovely separation that as this pigment dries, it will create lovely highlights in these regions already, which we'll accent in just a second. For me, a really important region to target with this black detail scheme is the inside of your engines. You've got the front vent at the beginning of the bike, and then of course your two side mounted engines just behind the seat. By putting the black contrast in that region, we create a nice dark zone, which of course it's in shadow because it is a recessed engine housing, but it also creates a lovely pop of contrast, and we're going to accentuate that region and draw the eye to it with some lovely weathering effects down the track. Now, once that's fully dried, we're going to accent these details one step further, bring them into that mechanical, metallic sort of sphere by doing a dry brush with Leadbelcher from Citadel Color. This is a pretty subtle effect for me. I don't like to go too crazy, but what you could do is really heavily dry brush it if you wanted to, and then wash that back with a little bit more Nuln oil. But for me, I love the blackened contrast look. This silver pop is just to go down to create a nice pop on all of the ridges and edging. So the vents, the gun details, particularly around the barrels, as well as the footrest and all of the various metal components that I want to look really kind of like they're a mechanical armature or an important metal component, are going to get this dry brush. So our speeder bike is starting to look absolutely fantastic. We've got all of this lovely detail work done, we've got our base tone for our paneling, and now it's time to bring in some color. Now I'm going for a red and grey scheme, but you could basically use those first three steps for whatever accent color you want to choose, whether that's the blue of the 501st or the orange of the 212th, whatever you're going with, you can kind of use those space steps and then just adapt my same techniques, my same processes, and just change the color. I'm going to be using the Citadel Color Contrast Paint Flesh Tearers Red to create my red accents, because I really like this red when it's applied over the grey scheme. It's not particularly bright, it's not a really bloody, gory red, it's kind of a nice muted, cool red, as opposed to a warm red, which we often work with. We saw a really lovely warm scheme with Count Dooku's cloak, which I'll link up there, but this is a nice cool red, which I think works really well for all of the Republic vehicles and Republic armor accents. So this Citadel contrast layer is essentially going to be going in a range of targeted areas. Now this is again an area of creative choice. You can pick out particular panels or armor regions that you want to create an accent, create a scheme. You don't have to follow my exact one, but I'm going to take you through my process just as a little guide. As always, give these contrast paints a really good shake to avoid pigment settling, and I'm going to start with the sidecar. Now, its big front armor panel, I'm going to give that a really big coat of red all over, and I'm also going to pick out a particular panel on the back behind the seat, but leave all of the grey edging around it. On the underside, I'm also going to pick out a couple of extra little panel regions that wrap up and around up to the base of the seat. As a general rule, when you're applying the contrast paints, you can gently move them around, keep nice control, and edge the pigment up to the recess of whatever armor panel you're painting, and then the pigment will naturally grab to that edge and it will allow you to contain the pigment to that particular armor panel. As long as you take some time and you're nice and careful, it's actually really easy to apply this paint just to specific regions when you keep your paint constrained to particular armor panels. But you may also want to go a little bit more funky, and on my speeder bike I want to create that really classic Republic look where there's a block of color just behind the seat that has a lovely curve pattern that accentuates from the top of the speeder bike down to the base of the seat. So the first thing I'm going to do is block out the panels that I know are going to be completely red and get those all sorted, and then I'll come in with my fine detail brush and just draw a rough curve line to kind of start to build up the curve as it goes from one point, almost in an exponential sort of shape, down to the base of that seat. Then I'll block in all of the color behind it, and I put that line down with a bit of margin to where I want that curve to finish, and then I can come back with the fine detail brush and just slowly accentuate that curve until I get really nice brush control and create the perfect shape of curve that I want on that armor panel. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side so that it's a mirror image, again just taking my time so I've got some nice curvature, and then we've got that lovely kind of accent pattern that draws your eye from the back of the speeder bike to the seat and is going to accent the rider, who is of course going to be the focal point of the entire model. So to further accent our focal point of the rider on this main speeder bike, we're going to rely once again on the process of framing. I'm going to use the red contrast paint to create a lovely red accent that runs all the way around the base of his seat and down the side of the speeder bike. It's a very long, kind of slim, elegant model, so by putting a nice long stripe of red, it creates a lovely kind of contour that draws your eye up the model to our rider. And our final accent is going to be a particularly detailed-ish pattern on the front of the bike around the main weapon assembly. So I eventually want to do that classic Republic curved look over the very front of that raised portion of the armor hull that goes up above the front engine. Now, because we're going over this raised section, I'm essentially just going to draw 2 lines just straight across the top of that raised section, then fill in everything behind them until you've got that triangle, then use your fine detail brush to massage the corner of the triangle into filling out that curve, and then you get a lovely curved detail section across the front of the armor panel. Now I've got the main body done, there's just a couple of extra little panels that I want to do underneath on the bottom of the hull, as well as on the sides of those extra armor plates that protrude out around the front weapon assembly, and there we can see we have a really nice scheme that has pops of red everywhere, some lovely contrast between the grey and red color scheme, and you can see that you could easily swap out this red color for any color scheme you want. Well, you know, 501st get the blue, 212th get the orange, there's beautiful green schemes out there. I'm pretty sure there were some purple regiments as well. There's a whole lot you can do, and in future videos we will have a look at some alternate schemes across different units, so stay tuned for those. If you've got any particular units you'd love me to see doing some alternate schemes for beyond this classic Republic look, feel free to put them down in the comments below. But I'm really happy with how our paneling is coming along. So the final little detail before we get into some weathering is to do our seat. The seat needs to be relatively dark so that it doesn't kind of draw attention away from our rider, but also blend with the rest of the scheme and not be too jarring. So I'm going to go for a nice neutral dark grey using the Basilicanum grey from the Citadel color contrast range. You just got to make sure you apply this nice and carefully because it is a darker grey. We're painting over the grey that's underneath, and we don't want to accidentally spill that onto the other armor panels, so keep it nice and controlled with a fine detail brush around those edges and apply a nice even coat all over the seat. So right now, our speeder bike looks like it's come just out of the factory on Camino. It's ready to go and take the fight to the Separatists, but I want my speeder bikes to look a little bit more in the thick of it, and I love to do this with all of my vehicles. We want to show a bit of wear, a bit of kind of grime, and a bit of use on these models, so it looks like that they're in the thick of it, they're killing some droids, and it makes them really come to life on the table. So the first thing we're going to do is, of course, a little bit of grime work, a little bit of filth and exhaust fumes and marks from the, you know, industrial elements that are in those engines. So I'm going to grab some Typhus Corrosion from the Citadel technical range, and this is a fantastic paint. It's one of my favorite paints, particularly from the technical range that GW do. It's a very much like a wash in its consistency, a kind of browny grey wash, but it's got really lovely oily grit in it. So what you can do is you can apply it and you can smear it around and it stains things. So what I'm going to do is load this up in various areas all over the model with a normal brush, and then I'm going to use a dry, brushy, bristly old brush to streak that grime and streak it as if exhaust is leaking out of vents and engines and then being whooshed down the side of the armor paneling as the speeder bike flows through the air. So we're hinting at that movement, we're hinting at the dynamic presence with a lovely technical paint. It's a really, really cool effect. So I'm going to load it up in all of my vents, around all of my engines, use that brush to put, you basically use your Typhus Corrosion brush to drop a dollop of it on the top of the engine, and then grab your dry brush and smear it down, staining the armor panel. You can work in tiny dots at a time if you're not brave using a heap of it, but I like to just throw it on there and move it around and see where it goes. And if you ever put too much down, just grab your thumb and wipe it back, and you can take it off really easily. So all around the engines, around some of the weapon assemblies, because there'd be grime in there, around all of the different vents, and you can get really, really creative with this, and I think it just really brings an extra level of detail to your vehicles. So with all that grime work down, our final step is to add a little bit of battle damage, and we're going to use a classic technique that was sort of more designed for use on models like, big World War II tanks or even 40k tanks, and that's to show chipping of the paint and show the metal underneath. Now, of course, in the Star Wars universe, not that much stuff is actually made from like classic steel. It's all made from weird composite futuristic materials that are far more like a plastic with extreme durable properties rather than a steel. So what we're going to do is lean into the paint wearing more than the actual metallic chipping, but we'll still use a bit of that as well. So the first thing we're going to do is grab some Stormvermin Fur, which is a layer paint from Citadel, and the key factor about this particular tone is that it's a nice grey that's subtle but darker than my main grey colour. So essentially what we're going to do is apply this in regions on the model where we want the light grey to have chipped to reveal the industrial prime underneath. So I'm going to grab a little sponge for this one, load up some of the Stormvermin grey on my sponge, and then sponge most of the paint off just onto a surface so that you can have only a little bit of paint left on your sponge, and then pick some particular areas and just sponge a little bit of dabs of paint onto your armor paneling. Now the key with this is less is more, so you don't want to go crazy, you don't want to have too much paint on your sponge and over apply it. You just want to do a little bit of flecks of paint here and there to show little chips that have been hit by shrapnel or maybe even a blaster bolt to reveal and chip off some of the paint. Then we're going to repeat that exact process going back to our Leadbelcher. Now obviously this material wouldn't be steel, but the little pops of silver just give the hint of battle damage. You know, maybe some of the shrapnel that's hit it is jammed in on the armor, maybe it's been sort of melted and scorched and gone a bit shiny by the particular blaster bolt that's blasted off it. So it just helps to really show that there's like that extra kind of corroded, damaged element on that particular piece of hull. Even if these models aren't steel, the little glint just really helps sell the effect. So I like to pick 2 or 3 kind of regions: the front of the model, the big sort of panel, the back around behind the seat, anywhere that's going to get hit by explosions from any direction, and you've got a lovely little bit of weathered battle damage on your speeder bike. So that is our speeder completely painted. We can now join our two halves together, see the sidecar with the bike, and what an awesome model this is. I think it looks absolutely fantastic on the table. Now we've got a few little things to do left. Of course, we need to do our crew and get into our basing. So I have primed my crew separately, as always, using the Tamiya bright white spray, and I'm just going to paint those using the exact same process that I outlined in my clone trooper painting video, which I'll link up ahead so that you can watch that if you haven't already. So there's a few points of difference when painting these clone trooper pilots. The first thing, of course, is that we can't really paint them normally because they don't have bases. So what I like to do is just drill a hole in their butt and then slot them onto a wooden skewer with a bit of foam as a handle, and that way we're going to get nice, easy access to all of that model. Now the way that these are assembled and glued together is slightly different as well. In this particular box set for the Barc Speeder, you get enough options to swap out the torso of the gunner in the sidecar so he can have a rocket launcher or use one of the two special weapons. So I have both of those torsos. The spare torso is just going to slot down on top of another skewer, and I also magnetize all of my heads for these pilots so that I can swap them between phase 1 and phase 2 down the track. But I'm going to go through that whole magnetization process in a future video. So as always, I just paint up my clones with my classic standard scheme, which is, you know, the beautiful Nuln or glaze with a dry brush, using some black Templar for detailing. It's a really simple scheme. If you haven't checked out the video for that, I'll link it above as before, and that one will be also down in the description below. Now the only other difference with these clones is, of course, they are holding some parts of the speeder bike. So the pilot here is holding the handlebars, and the clone gunner is either got the rocket launcher or holding the special weapon that slots on the top of the sidecar. So those are painted in the exact same way that all of the other black detail components are, with some black Templar and then dry brushed with Leadbelcher. So we can see there I've glued in the legs of the sidecar clone, and we can swap out those torsos, and we can already start to see without the pilot in, look how amazing the white armor looks in contrast with the red and the grey. The next thing to do is, of course, glue our pilot in. Now he's got his two handlebars which slot into those holes on the top of the hull. So we just want to put a little bit of super glue on the two ends of those handlebars. We're using super glue because, of course, we're gluing painted models that are the older plastic to the new plastic. And we also want to put some glue on the base of his feet and, of course, his butt, and that way we can gently slot him in. You want to line up the two holes first so that you're not accidentally smearing glue over the exposed armor paneling on the front. Once you've got those down, gently press them down, put his feet gently on the foot supports, and then slot him down onto the chair, and he will fall in place nicely. Hold him in position so that he's sitting in the right place and he doesn't move about, and then you've got all of your crew members glued in nicely. So there we can see our clone pilots on the Barc Speeder, and doesn't the model just come to life with the bright white pop of that clone armor, looking absolutely awesome. Almost done, but of course it's time to base the model. As always, I'm going to put some charred brown down on the actual base itself, and then we're going to do something a little bit different. My Barc Speeder is going to be flying over a rock formation. I've just made up a little plaster rock mold here using some vulcanized rubber rock molds. There's a whole bunch of companies that do them. Woodland Scenics, Heike. I'll even be selling some soon myself over at zorbazorb.com. So stay tuned for those. And essentially I'm going to glue that rock mold down, which has just been painted with the exact same color scheme you can see in my Geonosis terrain video, which I'll link up here. And I've glued that one down to the base just using some PVA. Now I'm going to apply my classic Mars Earth basing material, which is a fantastic foundation for any Geonosis scheme. I'm going to use my polyurethane ready basing glue from the Geek Gaming Scenic range, again available over at zorbazorb.com, and put that down all over the base, in particular around the rock formation, so we can blend that into the base, but we want to keep that glue away from the arc line so that we can still see the arc once the basing material has gone down. Obviously super important for gameplay. Leave that glue for a couple of minutes to let it go a little sticky and tacky, and then I'm just going to drop a whole bunch of this Mars Earth basing material, which is again available at zorbazorb.com, straight onto the base. It's a gorgeous material full of beautiful pigmented grouts and adhesives and fine gravels that are the perfect scale for Legion miniatures. We're going to let that fully dry, give it half an hour or so, and then I'm going to come back, tap off all of the excess, particularly grab a brush and brush through those arc lines to make sure that you haven't got any excess loose pigment blocking those up, and make sure that you can see them really nicely. And then we're just going to do a little bit of paint work to lift or elevate the red of this Mars Earth to a more orangey brown Geonosis scheme. So I'm going to grab my Plague Brown from Vallejo and do a dry brush all over the Mars Earth there, even a little bit over the top of the rock mold, and then I'm going to glue down my model. Now I've got one more highlight to go on that sand, but I'm going to put the model on its base first, and you'll see why in just a second. So it's time to attach our acrylic rod to our rock mold. Now I'm actually using an old acrylic mod from 40k. You could certainly use the conventional one that comes in the box, but I wanted to use something a little bit longer to give my Barc Speeder a little bit more height. So I'm going to grab my pin vise and I'm going to drill a hole directly into my plaster rock mold. Now I cast my rock molds from a very high strength plaster called Hydracal or Hydra Stone, and it is a really fantastic plaster with great tensile and compressive strength, so you can drill into it and stick a rod in it and it's not going to rip out or chip, particularly as the Barc Speeder doesn't have a ridiculous amount of weight. So drill a hole down into that, and then I'm going to glue that rod in with some weld bond, and then I'm just going to grab a little bit of Mars Earth to blend the edge of the acrylic rod where I've got glue spilling over with the rocky surface of the rock mold. Then once that's fully dry, you do want to let that properly bond before you put weight on it. Give it like, 2 hours really. Then you can just slot your Barc Speeder down on the plastic rod. You don't have to glue him on. He slots on with a snug fit, which is perfect because it means later on I can change the bases for my Barc Speeders depending on what board I'm playing on, which is something we'll be diving into in a future video. And there we can see the Barc is looking absolutely awesome. I've put the plastic rod on a cool bit of an angle to create a nice dynamic pose as he's kind of getting hit by a bit of uplift as he flies over the rock mold with his repulsor engines, which I think looks pretty awesome. Now the final step is to just add the final highlight, which is going to be with some khaki from Vallejo to our Geonosis basing scheme. Now the reason I waited until I had the model on is because this highlight mimics the sunlight hitting the base. And what I want to do is just dry brush all of these regions that are exposed on the sides of the base or not blocked from a top-down light source above the Barc Speeder. And that way we can sort of almost create a sense of the shadow of the Barc Speeder as it flies across the Geonosis plains. So put that highlight down all around the edges, imagining a little sort of silhouette dropping down onto the base, and then after that our Barc Speeder is finished. We have a pretty awesome looking model. I'm so happy with the dynamic pose. I really like the way it's kind of ripping up and flying over. Again, obviously this does change the way that the repulsor vehicle interacts with terrain, so if you wanted to take this to a tournament you would need to have another one that you could sort of swap in its place and get your opponent's permission beforehand, but I just think it's absolutely worth it to have him flying over like that, and it looks so cool, and I love the color scheme.
So there we have it, guys, the Barc Speeder for the Republic, ready to take the fight to the Separatists. I'm really happy with how this scheme came out. I think choosing a grey, kind of darker palette for the hull really works nicely in contrast with the bright white of the clones, and it works in really great combination with the red as well. I really love the red-grey look, but there's certainly other schemes that we could try out there. If you want to try a different colour, by all means, you can simply just swap out that red contrast paint to something else in your colour palette. Perhaps we'll do a video in the future looking at some really cool different vehicle painting schemes based off different regions or regiments. We could do like the 212th from Utapau or some Kashyyyk troopers. Lots of options for us in the future. Of course, the 501st is going to be covered very soon indeed. So I'm super happy with how they turned out. A little bit of extra battle damage just goes, a long way to make them really stand out, and a bit of grime them up, give them some character. And I'm super excited to take that to the next level on our next tutorial coming out next week for the Saber Tank. We're going to do a deep dive on some awesome weathering and just a really great color scheme in the same vein for that stock standard Republic look. And then once again, we'll start to get more complex with color schemes in the future. If you guys are enjoying these videos and would like to leave me any feedback or any suggestions on what you'd like to see, drop it in the comments down below. And if you love what I'm doing and would love to support the channel, feel free to head on over to Patreon. The Patreons are a huge part of everything that we do here. So thank you so much to all of those guys. And thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Zorba Gaming. Cheers, guys.